Now don't everyone clamor for this gorgeous sweater jacket all at once, for it already has a planned destination. Hello, Shirley Adams here with the fourth program in Series 3 of the Sewing Connection. We're going to look into sweatering, what to look for, what to avoid, how to handle it. Now what's wrong with this lovely sweater is that it stretches unbelievably. I mistakenly thought that to cover these seams, to reinforce them, to stabilize them with some ultra suede could do the job, but it didn't. This is so large that you and I could both fit in here and still have room for your Aunt Mary, and it keeps growing and growing. It could have been perhaps stabilized with a fusible interfacing on the inside, and then I could have inserted a lining, and it might have helped. But every once in a while, you just have to admit to a complete disaster and quit wasting any more time on it. Just file it away and move on to something more profitable, such as looking at what we can find out in the stores that are going to work better. Now, the groups that I have down here are divided like this. Here is just sweatering by the yard, and it might come in any fiber content imaginable, from cottons to wools or anything in between, the synthetics. But there are no finished edges anywhere. It's just cut. It will fray out easily, so you're going to have to, of course, treat all those edges. With that, very often comes ribbing, because the ribbing is going to clench it in then at the wrists and every place where it needs to be so that it won't just stay loose. When you do buy any of this, test it for recovery, by the way. See what happens if you stretch it out and then let go. See if it does recover or if it stays stretched out. Now, because I have ribbing for this, if this stretches a little and doesn't completely recover, I find this quite stable, really. It barely stretches out at all. But if it doesn't quite recover, it would be all right. The ribbing is going to bring it in tightly at every place, and it's going to be fine. The other categories are sweater bodies, and very often shops carry these sweater bodies. This is what they look like. They have a finished edge here with all the ribbing, and besides this finished edge up here, they have a semi-finished edge down at the bottom. Well, this one's rather small, so beware of that. Make sure that you know what size this is. This is not large enough to put around me. I couldn't wear this as a skirt, for instance, nor could I wear it as a sweater. But the way I could wear it is to cut it into 2 sleeves. So that's exactly what I would do with this. I cut it into the 2 sleeves, and you can see that's about what I've done here. This was another small sweater body that I had for these sleeves, and cut off like this, it worked just fine. Now this body here was a sweater body also, no seams anywhere, it's all in one piece here. And then what I've done on top is stitch an antique tablecloth just for fun. It looks like some sort of a popcorn pebble knit stitch there, but it's kind of a fun thing. Here's the skirt that goes along with it, and I would like to have used that ribbed edge for the hem, but I couldn't. It came in too tight, so it wouldn't do that. What I did is use the other end for the hem, and I just did a little stitching on that to stabilize it down here so that it wouldn't fall apart, and it worked out just fine for the hem. And then I put an extra piece here at the waist with some elastic in, so it works for a skirt. So this is a 2-piece knit dress made from sweater bodies. Frequently what you find in the stores, instead of these sweater bodies that you buy individually, is actually sweater kits. So here's what a sweater kit looks like. It's quite heavy because there's so much in it, so no matter what your size, if you look at these sweater kits, you'll probably find something that's going to work just right. What this has in it is several sweater bodies, and this is a real fine gauge knit. It's very soft, it's cotton, it has a finished edge here, and at the other end it also has that semi-finished edge where it came off the knitting machine. And then on the sides you'd have to stabilize that a little bit. But this has several pieces in it. There are several sweater bodies here, and they're all really quite large. So you would cut them to size and make seams in them. It would be a good idea with any of these to pre-treat them, of course, especially this cotton sweatering, because you know it's going to shrink somewhat. So treat it right now before you cut it out the same way that you're going to after you have the sweater made, whether that's washing it by hand and putting it out on a towel to dry, or whether you're planning to do the whole thing, wash her maybe a little bit in the dryer, but then you better either hang it or put it out flat to finish it up, I would guess. Also in these sweater kits you have ribbing, and even though these sweater pieces, these sweater bodies, have a lot of stretch in, even if they don't recover beautifully, which this one does, you have these ribbings that you can stitch around the cuffs everywhere, and so this will bring it in. So this is a sweater kit, and they really work quite nicely. Something you might want to consider. Then available, you might find these. These are little knit bands. They could be used perhaps for the lower edge of a sweater, that kind of a band, or they could go right in the midsection of a sweater. Maybe this would be an all-pink sweater with just this little section across the chest or somewhere. Little hearts on this one. So you find a whole lot of these in different patterns, different colors, but a lot of variety out there, and it's fun to do if you don't knit yourself, to look into some of these. Now mainly what I want to know about any of these is what's going to happen when I cut them out, when I stitch them, whatever I'm going to do, what's going to happen. So I'd like to try this out always on some scraps to find out exactly what's going to happen. I have some scraps down here, and I'm going to do a little sewing. And the sewing I'm going to do is to find out, for one thing, what will happen if I stitch it vertically right along one of the ribs there, because vertically it is more stable. Horizontally it of course is more stretchy. But you have two different problems involved here, and I always like to try that out. Some of these, the big problem is as soon as you cut it out, it rolls up, and it's very hard to keep stretched out and be able to work with it at all. When you do cut it out, it's a good idea to use a smooth surface. If you're one of the rug cutters, it's not good to put this on the carpeting because that very likely would stretch it out of shape as it catches to the texture of the carpeting, and it might be very difficult then to know exactly what you have. After you get it up off that, it might revert to its former size and be too tight. So it's better to cut it out on a smooth surface so that it can slip and retain its own natural shape without being distorted in any way. So I'm going to do a little stitching on this, both vertically and horizontally, because you have, as I started to say, two different sets of problems there. Usually the problems going up and down vertically are the fact that, and those would be side seams, is the fact that it might kind of roll toward the back side. You might even have to use a little glue stick on this if you want to get it to work out just right so that it doesn't roll. You might have to use lots of pins or diagonally based. This one seems to have no problems whatsoever. It's perfectly flat here, and so it won't present a problem to stitch it. Now when I do stitch it, I would like to make either 2 rows of straight stitching if I'm going to use the machine. I would like to use just 2 rows of stitching there. Or what my neat little pictures here tell me to do is to use a twin needle, which would be a really good idea. You get both of those rows of stitching at once, and what happens with the bobbin is that it's underneath going back and forth. The thread is to catch those 2 top threads, and you therefore have some stretch in it that you wouldn't if you just stitched 2 straight rows. So anyway, 2 straight rows are one of the choices. Another one that I'm going to try here, though, because 2 straight rows are obvious, so I needn't show you what they look like. Another one I'm going to try is one that stitches along and back and forth, so that it would be very good to see how this stitches back and forth. This would be very good to hold the edges flat if this sweater would be the type that would curl on the edges. This would hold it nice and flat, and it wouldn't give any problems. So after I have this all stitched, and here you can see what it looks like with that type of stitch I did. After I have this stitched then, the 2 layers together, I would just trim them both off close to the stitching. You can see how now that I've stitched it does want to start to roll a little bit. So I would just trim that off close and it wouldn't present a problem. For those of you who think, well gosh, I don't have a serger, I can't do any sewing on sweaters, yes you can. You can work with the machine and it'll do just fine for you. But this isn't usually the biggest problem. The bigger one is when you stitch it crosswise. So I'm going to put these other 2 edges together, and that would be a shoulder seam is where that crosswise stitch would be. I'm going to put these upper 2 edges together and see what happens if I do the same stitch crosswise. And here I might find a little more stretching. Oh, well maybe I just have an easy knit here to work with and it's not going to stretch out at all. It doesn't look bad. But if you do find that you have stretching, what you want to do to cure that is to put a little stabilizer in of some sort. It might be this hem tape or some twill tape, or sometimes we just cut off a little bit of selvage from the edge of some fine firmly woven fabric and use that because there's no stretch there. So anything you want to use to stabilize it, if that's necessary, you put there along with it under the foot and go ahead and stitch through the 3 layers, the stabilizer, the tape, as well as the others, and then there won't be any stretching. But think carefully about that, whether you want to stabilize it or not, because, for instance, if this would stretch a lot and you have it all stabilized up here on your shoulder and everywhere it's stretching out, it might look all gathered on the shoulder. So maybe you don't want to stabilize it. Maybe you do want to do just some sort of a stitch that semi-stabilizes it, but permits it to go over your shoulder a little bit for a dropped shoulder look. So think about it, experiment on these scraps and see what's going to happen. I know that you probably don't want to cut up a whole sweater body to experiment on, but if you have sweater by the yard, just the yardage with no finished edges, then you can always buy just a little bit of extras so that you can do some of this experimentation and see what you have to work with. Another way you would do this is on the serger. Either one work out beautifully, and I'm going to do the same thing, just stitch this on the serger and see what it looks like. Now, I have this set so that I am expecting it to ripple as I serge this because I do not have the differential feed set into play. You know, it doesn't do too badly. That means I have one here that's really easy to handle, but the outer edge doesn't look wonderful there. See how it kind of goes off the sweater, and it just doesn't look too terrific. I'm going to move this differential feed down, and what it does now is kind of push this sweater through. It kind of scrunches it all up closely and pushes it through so that if it does tend to do any stitching, it won't show on this. So with another piece here, or another couple of pieces, here I have one, or perhaps I'll just take this out and use it again on the other side. Let's see now what it looks like if I do use that differential feed. And there are circumstances when you really wouldn't want to do both of these together. There are times when possibly it would look better if you would finish these seams separately and then sew them together. Can you see how I now have that differential scrunched up too closely together in that it's sort of gathering up slightly? So you need to adjust that for any knit that you use. Need to adjust it so that it does work out just right. And see how now it is sort of scrunched together. This one is rippled out a little bit. So whichever way it is that you're going to work with it, whether you have that differential set up close or if it's too far apart here and ripples, get somewhere that's a balance that does it just right. And of course, what that something is going to be different for each piece of fabric you use. So you have to do a little bit of comparison there, a little bit of trying it out to see exactly what happens. Now, besides having those two seams taken care of, the verticals and the horizontals, I also would like to find out what kind of a hem I can do on this that works out just right. And for the hems, I might try just with one layer of fabric, just serging it and finishing it that way and seeing if that looks all right, then fold it up and stitched by hand. Or would it be better if I would put some sort of a tape on it? Well, as I experimented with this one, what I decided before I made this dress that it went into, what I had decided was that it was better to use a hem tape on this. So here I have a tape because this seemed to make it flattest. It's been hanging for a while. A lot of sweater knits are better off if they don't hang, if they fold up and are put in a drawer instead. But the fact that this was a big long dress, I have had this on a hanger. And now I see because it has been hanging, it has possibly stretched out a little bit longer, and I see that hem rippling slightly where it didn't at first. So be careful about these things. If that gives you a problem, then here are a couple of other ways that you can treat that, and I'll get back to this one later, so I'll just put it there out of the way. One thing you might do with that to eliminate the problem of anything stretching anywhere is to stabilize it completely. Now this was a very thin knit, and I decided it needed a little beefing up. So what I have inside here is a woven fabric, kind of a silky lining fabric, and what this fabric does is completely stabilize it as well as beefing it up, and it won't stretch out of shape. It won't stretch out longer. It will stay in this nice shape. So the way I did this before I started constructing any seams was to first of all serge together, stay stitching away, but I guess I did stay stitch and then serge the edges to just finish them off. But I put these two layers together first, and then I did the seams afterwards. So this one worked out very well this way. This also has some top stitching here horizontally, and no problem there as long as it had that stability underneath by having the underlining. That, by the way, is what that layer of fabric underneath is called, the underlining. Let me show you on a couple of skirts what are some of the differences between whether you decide to underline these knits or align them, or possibly do nothing, as I did nothing to the red dress. But here's the skirt of that same top, and this has been underlined. Now what I really liked about underlining this is the fact that there are no dimples that show at the hem. In the red dress you saw a few little dimples, a few little dips at the hem because it was pulling slightly, even though I stitched that by hand very carefully. This doesn't show at all for this reason, because it's attached only to the underlining. And that's another good purpose for putting underlining in there. You just very carefully stitch to that and don't have any of your stitches hit the outer layer. So you can get a really nice, expensive designer look on it if you have that underlining. That might be the most appropriate for some things. I really debated about that when I made this knit dress, this sweater knit dress. But the reason I didn't use it here is because I looked at the envelope. They said nothing whatsoever about lining, underlining, and so on. And I thought, well, they know what they're talking about. If I would do that, if I would underline it, possibly I would destroy all this nice pleating that occurs in the front. So I followed their directions and did not do it. Sometimes it works out well that way. Sometimes you want to use your own judgment because they certainly don't know what kind of fabric you're going to use, so they don't know how to advise you. Here's as a contrast to this blue skirt, which is underlined. The contrast is this skirt. This is not a knit, it's a woven, but this skirt has been lined, in case you're wondering. Now, what's the difference between the two? This is a lined skirt, so the lining is completely separate. It's sewn as one skirt. The tweed is sewn as another skirt. They're then just attached later around the waist, whereas this is attached right at the beginning before it's ever stitched together, and it works out quite well. One time when I wanted to know exactly what designers do in a knit dress of this sort, I went to look at a very expensive one done by a big name designer, and I found that this was the kind of hem they had in it, which also works very well. What that hem is it's been reinforced. It has some bias cut reinforcement in here, and that reinforcement is just tacked very loosely to the outside dress, and then it's sewn more firmly to the edge of the hem, and you can't see on the outside anything because it reinforces it. It pads it out, and it ends up looking very nice there. So use a little judgment and use some of those samples to play with to find out what's going to work out the best for you. I'm also going to think about what kind of a zipper to put in these if I want zippers. In this one, because I had top stitching here in other places, that zipper top stitched in the back might have looked just fine. But when I got to the back, there, get this back on the hanger. So when I got to the back, I then did top stitch it, the same as I had top stitching other places. This other one, the red one here, I did not top stitch it by machine. I instead did this by hand. A little back stitch is what it is when you put a zipper in by hand. And the reason I did that is because a machine zipper, machine stitched in here, would have been so prominent, and there was no other top stitching anywhere on this dress. No stitching showed, so it would have been a little out of place, I thought, to put it on the back. It was more sensible, therefore, to just do a hand-picked zipper here. And they are really quite simple to do. Just a little back stitch every time you come up, and you work from the right side and do it quite easily. So consider these things. You will also have to consider what you're going to do about the edges. Are you, for instance, going to have ribbing around those edges? And if you are, then that finishes it up very nicely. Here again, you'd use either the serger to put on that ribbing so that it all connects, or you'd use the same as I did for seams on the machine, use the 2 rows of straight stitching, or a twin needle preferably, or one of the sideways stitches, the zigzag types, that would hold that together nicely. So with ribbing, this wouldn't be a problem. It would replace the hems and it would take care of everything. Now if you actually have ribbing, see all those ribs in it? If you actually have ribbing, it always has a great deal of stretch in it. And if that's the case, the amount of ribbing you cut to put on this top, because the pattern didn't tell me to do this, it was actually a one-piece dress, and it was just sort of bloused and attached to the skirt. I did this on my own because I decided I wanted a two-piece dress out of it. So the way you cut this ribbing is, if this top, for instance, measured 40 inches wide, then I would want the ribbing to measure 30 inches wide. 4:3 ratio is what I'm doing here with this ribbing. If it doesn't stretch a whole lot, and this one really didn't all that much. If I have a really stretchy ribbing, as some of them are, then it would be a 2:3 ratio. With this one, I would guess this one really stretches out and recovers. This I would do a 2:3 ratio. So depending on how stretchy it is what kind of a ribbing you put on, how much you cut, how large you make that ribbing. If you're not going to have ribbing to finish the edges, then you need to decide on some other alternatives. One of the alternatives I have up here is this one. Instead of doing any ribbing on this, because this was sweater yardage, there was no ribbing that would go with this. I could have used a solid black probably. There's red, green, and black in this. And I could have used a solid black or a gray. That would have done nicely. A black. It would have to be a black or it would look like you couldn't match it. But instead I chose to go with this ultra suede, and that's because I wanted to wear it with a black ultra suede skirt. So this was simply using an edging here to finish it off that made a complete outfit, because you do want to think in completes. What am I going to wear it with? There's no sense in having one thing in your closet that goes with nothing. So think of a complete outfit as you're planning this and work accordingly. So that's why this ultra suede banding is on the edge. Now there is no stretch in this. It's completely stable. So be sure that when you cut this and stitch it onto the sweater, that you have this sweater in the right shape. And the way you get it in the right shape is possibly, before you stitch the suede on, possibly to put your pattern back down on top to see if it has condensed or if it's stretched, see if it's done anything nasty, because, for instance, if it has condensed, it would sort of dip up here in the middle as it's stitched to the ultra suede, and it would look very bad. In order to get those stripes to go straight across, you need to be sure, this is what I'm talking about, these stripes in the sweater to go straight across, you need to be sure that it's stretched out the proper amount. The reverse could also happen, of course. If you actually stretch it too much, then it would dip down into a V and it would just look really bad. So be careful about that. So this is another alternative in case you don't have ribbing. And then what I've done to the hems in this is serge the edges first to finish them off, and then after they were serged, then they are hemmed by hand, just very carefully, so that I don't really catch the outer layer enough to show, so that I don't have dimples there. It makes it a little easier if you have patterned sweatering, because then nothing shows as easily as it would on solid sweatering. Here's another one that didn't have any ribbing to go with it. Now when I bought this one, it was a sweater body. You can see it has a finished edge down here at the bottom, and also I was able to use a finished edge at the sleeves, but then I had nothing to put here. So what this is, this band that goes around the neck and down the fronts and has the buttonholes in it, this is simply more of this same, it's just a little strip of this same sweatering that I cut, and it goes around, it's double layers, and then it's serged on here. There again, think whether it's going to condense or whether it's going to stretch out, and get that on just right so that it hangs nicely at the bottom. Another sweater that I have here had no ribbing to match it. Yes, it did too. It did have ribbing, so I do have ribbing on this one, and around this band that goes around the neck. This is also ribbing. This one is a big oversized sweater. It does have this ribbing everywhere. Pockets also are going to have to be treated in whatever way probably that you bind the front edges, either with ribbing or with the self fabric or maybe with some suede. Whatever it is that's going to be most appropriate on this is what you would put on it. If you need to get a little practice on this, if you think, well, gosh, I'd like to go into those shops and just get something and work on it right away, what if it doesn't work out right and you're a little bit afraid to do it? Here's a good starter. You probably have at least one sweater in your closet of which you are not too fond and of which you are not going to be getting any use out of. You might think about doing this. Get a little pattern for a child's garment and practice before you actually cut out a sweater for yourself, just to practice working with a sweater knit, even though it isn't the one you're going to use. So here's the little pattern. I would put it right down at the bottom so that I could make use of that ribbing that comes with the sweater, and I would cut it out of that. And then because I didn't have any ribbing here around the neck, I put a hood on it with a little drawstring through it, and that worked out well. But that was my practice before I started using the sweatering that I bought in the store. Well, there are so many super knitting machines available that you may start knitting on your own, but at least think of doing a little cut and sew work on sweaters. Since I threw away that awful sweater jacket, I need something to take its place. Join me next time and we'll make a really easy coat, a one-layer coat.